There is a group of people living in the Appalachian Mountains right now who, for over 200 years, had no explanation for what they were. Dark skin, high cheekbones, light eyes, Scots-Irish drawl, Baptist church on Sundays. They looked like no category America had. So, America made them a problem. Census takers skipped them. Courts stripped their rights. Neighbors gave them a name that started as a slur. And the people themselves, when pressed, gave the only answer that kept them safe. We're Portuguese. We're Turkish. Our ancestors were sailors, shipwrecked, Mediterranean. They walked into these mountains centuries ago. For generations, that story passed through mountain hollers like gospel. Then DNA arrived, and it destroyed every single one of those myths. The answer wasn't Mediterranean, it wasn't ancient, it was American. Hidden inside 4 centuries of American history, buried so deliberately, disguised so carefully that it tells you almost everything you need to know about how race worked in this country, and how far people will go to survive it. This is the story of the Melungeons, and it is stranger, darker, and more human than any legend about Portuguese sailors. To understand who they really were, you have to start with the land, not as scenery, as an explanation. Before we start, what part of the world are you in? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Picture the southern Appalachian Mountains. Not a single ridge, but a whole corrugated world of parallel ridges and narrow valleys running northeast to southwest. The land in Hancock and Hawkins counties in northeastern Tennessee, just over the border into Lee County in southwestern Virginia, and into the eastern edge of Kentucky, forms one of the most isolated regions in the eastern United States. Newman's Ridge, Vardy Valley, places where mountain walls made travel difficult and outsiders rare, where a community could exist for generations in a kind of geographic envelope, separate from the plantation lowlands, separate from the major roads, folded into the terrain. That isolation was not accidental. For the families who would become known as Melungeons, the mountains were not a home they had always known. They were a destination, a refuge. They ended up there because further east, the world had become impossible. The word Melungeon itself is still contested. Its etymology is genuinely unclear. Scholars have suggested a connection to the French word for mixture, or to an Afro-Portuguese word meaning something like companion or shipmate, or to other sources entirely. The origin of the name mirrors the mystery of the people. Both carry uncertainty at their core. What is documented is that the term was applied from the outside, used as an insult by white neighbors in the early 1800s, and attached to roughly 40 core families concentrated in those Tennessee and Virginia mountain counties. Surnames like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, and Mullins appear again and again in the historical record. Today, estimates of people who carry Melungeon ancestry range into the hundreds of thousands, scattered across the South and far beyond. But what does the word actually mean, genetically and historically? This is the first place where the story gets complicated. The label Melungeon was never a tribe, never a nation, never a biological category with clean edges. It was a social classification applied inconsistently, contested constantly, and ultimately reclaimed by descendants who found power in owning it. And the genetic ancestry inside those 40 families is not identical. Different family lines carry different proportions of different ancestries. The mountains saw to that. 400 miles of isolated hollows meant individual communities developed their own patterns. So, when we talk about who the Melungeons were, we are really asking about the founding conditions that brought those families into being. And for that, we have to travel back not just to Appalachia, but to colonial Virginia, and to a window of time that most American history tends to skip past. The families that would eventually be called Melungeons appear in the colonial Virginia record in the late 1600s and early 1700s, not as enslaved people, as free people of color, free mulattoes, in the language of the era. They owned property, they paid taxes. For a time, some of them voted. They lived on the margins of colonial society, but they were not in chains, and that distinction would shape everything that followed. Where did they come from before that? This is where DNA speaks most directly. Researchers who study genetics use different tools to trace different lines of ancestry. The Y chromosome passes from father to son, generation after generation, without being mixed with the mother's genetics. It carries markers called haplogroups that trace a specific paternal line back through time. Mitochondrial DNA works in the opposite direction, passed only through mothers to their children, tracing a direct maternal line. And then there is autosomal DNA, the broader mixture inherited from all ancestral lines simultaneously. It captures more of the picture but becomes diluted across generations, making it less precise for very distant ancestry. When researchers analyzed the core Melungeon families using Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Genetic Genealogy in 2012 by researchers Roberta Estes, Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane, the results came as a shock to many people who had spent years building a different picture. The maternal lines, traced through mitochondrial DNA, were predominantly European, Northern and Central European. The paternal lines, traced through the Y chromosome, were predominantly Sub-Saharan African. In plain terms, the evidence suggests that the founding generation of these families came from African men and European women, meeting somewhere in the colonial Chesapeake world before the full machinery of racial slavery had locked into place. This is where understanding colonial American history becomes essential. Before roughly the 1660s and 1670s, the legal and social lines between African and European in Virginia were not yet fully hardened. The plantation economy was still forming. Some Africans in early Virginia were treated as indentured servants rather than permanent slaves. They completed their terms, gained their freedom, owned land, hired their own labor. The line that would become absolute had not yet been drawn. And in that window, in the frontier zones and the tobacco settlements of early Virginia, African men and European women formed families. Their children were born free, because under colonial law at the time, the status of the child followed the status of the mother, and the mothers were free women. Research suggests that it was this founding generation, African fathers, European mothers, free children, who became the ancestors of the families that would one day be called Melungeons. But then the law changed. Virginia and the other colonies began hardening the racial codes. Rights were stripped from free people of color. By the early 1700s, free black and mixed-race families faced new restrictions on voting, on owning weapons, on testifying in court, on marrying white partners. The world they had been born into was being reorganized around them, and the category of free person of color was becoming increasingly dangerous to occupy. So, the families moved. This is the migration that made the Melungeons, not from Portugal, not from Turkey, from Virginia. They migrated along the Appalachian corridor, moving steadily southwest. Through North Carolina, where tax records show them listed as free mulattoes in Orange County in the mid-1700s. On into the Yadkin Valley, then the New River Country, then further still into the Tennessee frontier, arriving at Newman's Ridge and Vardy Valley by the early 1800s. With every move, they intermarried with white settlers. They adopted English and Scots-Irish surnames. Their appearance lightened across generations. On the 1790 census, some of those same families who had been listed as mulattoes just decades earlier appeared as white. The classification shifted not just because of law, but because of how the families had navigated it, through movement, intermarriage, and selective presentation. The mountains offered what the Virginia Piedmont no longer could: distance from the plantation economy, frontier conditions that left more room for ambiguity, and neighbors who had not been watching closely enough to know the full story. That ambiguity was not accidental. It was survival. There is also the question of Native American ancestry. The mythology around the Melungeons placed heavy weight on Indian blood, partly because claiming Native heritage was seen as less dangerous than claiming African heritage, and partly because the physical appearance of many Melungeon families suggested to outsiders that something indigenous was in the mix. DNA evidence has found some Native American ancestry in lines ancestral to certain Melungeon families, including the Sizemore line, but the direct paternal and maternal testing of the core families did not find it as a dominant or consistent signal. It was real in places. It was not the foundation. The Indian identity in the Melungeon story was partly genuine in some lines, partly protective in all of them, and amplified far beyond the genetic evidence by generations of myth. Which brings us to the myths themselves, because the myths are not a separate story from the DNA. They are part of the same story. The Portuguese theory, the Turkish settlers theory, the Phoenician sailors theory, the lost colony of Roanoke theory. These were not old memories passed down from actual Mediterranean ancestors. They were strategies, carefully maintained, collectively reinforced, legally useful strategies for surviving in a country where being identified as black means losing everything. Under the racial codes of the antebellum South, and later under Jim Crow, claiming African ancestry meant exclusion from white schools, from the ballot, from property rights, from the right to marry across the color line. The laws were explicit and brutal. Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, nearly 2 centuries after those original families had started moving through the mountains, was still targeting mixed heritage families with legal force, invalidating marriages and scrutinizing family histories for any trace of non-white ancestry. The myth of Mediterranean origin was not romantic fantasy. It was legal armor. Will Allen Dromgoole, a Tennessee journalist, wrote a series of pieces in 1891 that sensationalized the Melungeons and embedded the exotic origins mythology in the popular imagination, describing them as mysterious half-breeds with dark features and strange customs. The framing was condescending, but it also fed a particular story that Melungeon families themselves had been telling for different reasons. By the 1990s, writer Brent Kennedy published a widely read book claiming Turkish and Portuguese ancestry for the Melungeons, and many descendants embraced the idea fiercely. It offered an identity that was colorful, ancient, and free from the stigma that American racial history had attached to African ancestry. The book made national news. Communities organized around the Turkish and Mediterranean theory. Then the DNA results came out in 2012, and the reaction was intense. LID researcher Roberta Estes later noted that many people were upset by the findings. That reaction deserves honest attention. When a community has spent generations building a protective mythology, when that mythology was not simply a vanity, but a shield against violence, dispossession, and legal persecution, having it dismantled by a laboratory is not a neutral event. It carries the full weight of what American racial history did to these families over 400 years. But the researchers were careful to make a point that deserves to be heard clearly. The true story is not shameful. It is not lesser. It is the story of people who navigated the most brutal racial architecture in American history and survived. African men and European women in early colonial Virginia formed families during a window when survival was possible. When the law closed that window, their descendants moved. When the next territory grew hostile, they moved again. They renamed themselves, intermarried strategically, carried English surnames into mountain hollows where no one would ask too many questions, and told the Portuguese story until even their own children believed it. That is not a weakness. That is the full force of human adaptability applied against an impossible system. Across the broader Appalachian region, the Melungeons were not unique. Scholars of American history have documented similar communities across the South, groups sometimes called triracial isolates, meaning communities formed where European, African, and indigenous populations converged, usually in frontier zones where racial enforcement was loose enough to allow it. The Lumbee people of North Carolina, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina, the Redbones of Louisiana and Texas. Each of these groups formed in conditions similar to the Melungeons, and each developed their own set of identity strategies for surviving inside American racial classification. The Melungeons were one version of a wider American story, and even within the Melungeon communities themselves, the genetic picture is not uniform. The same mountains that sheltered these families also separated them. Newman's Ridge families had different histories than Vardee Valley families. Some lines carry more European ancestry, some carry more African. Some collateral lines show genuine Native American admixture through women who married into the families. The autosomal DNA picture, that broader mixture across all ancestral lines, is still being studied. Researchers have noted that the picture is not yet fully closed, and that some results point toward ancestral diversity that direct line testing alone cannot fully capture. The science is real, and it is also still being refined. What we are left with then is not a simple answer, but a fully human one. They were the children of a specific American moment, a window in early colonial history when some African men were free, when European women on the Virginia frontier formed families across a line that was not yet fully patrolled, and when those children, once the law turned against them, had the resources and the determination to start moving and not stop until they reached mountains high enough to hide in. The word Melungeon started as an insult. The DNA behind it is the record of 4 centuries of survival. And the communities that carry that identity today, whatever mixture of ancestry each individual holds, are the living descendants of people who refused, through movement, myth, intermarriage, and sheer endurance, to be erased by a system designed to erase them. DNA doesn't give a simpler story, it gives a truer one. And the truth, when you hold it fully, is not diminished by the absence of Portuguese sailors. It is made larger by what actually happened. In the mountain hollows of Appalachia, in the fog over Newman's Ridge, in the names on those faded census pages shifting from mulatto to other free to white, you can read the whole arc of what these people chose to do. They chose to survive, and they did.